HOGHTON Tower. About a month after the occurrence last described, and early on a fine morning in August, Nicholas HOGHTON and Richard Sherborne rode forth together from the proud town of Preston. Both were gaily attired with doubles and hose of yellow velvet, slashed with white silk with mantles to match, the latter being somewhat conspicuously embroidered on the shoulder with a wild bull worked in gold, and underneath it the motto Malgré Litort, followed at a respectful distance by 4 mounted attendants. The two gentlemen had crossed the bridge over the Ribble and were wending their way along the banks of the tributary stream, the Darwen, within a short distance of the charming village of Walton-le-Dale, when they perceived a horseman advancing slowly towards them, whom they instantly hailed as Richard HOGHTON, and pushing forward were soon beside him. Both were much shocked by the young man's haggard looks, and inquired anxiously as to his health, but Richard bade them with a melancholy smile not to be uneasy, for all would be well with him ere long. All will be over with you if you don't mind, and that's perhaps what you mean, replied Nicholas. But as soon as the royal festivities at HOGHTON are over, I'll set about your cure, and what's more, I'll accomplish it, for I know where the seat of the disease lies better than Dr. Morphew, your family physician at Middleton. 'Tis near the heartache, near the heart. I see I have touched you, lad, but beshrew me, you are very strangely attired, in a suit of sable velvet, with a black Spanish hat and feather for a festival. You look as if going to a funeral. I am fearful his majesty may take it amiss. Why not wear the livery of our house? Nay, if it comes to that, rejoined Richard, why do not you and Sherborne wear it, instead of flaunting like doors in borrowed plumage? I scarce know you in your strange garb, and certainly should not take you for an HOGHTON, or aught pertaining to our family, from your gaudy colours and the strange badge on your shoulder. I don't wonder at it, Dick, said Nicholas. I scarce know myself, and though the clothes I wear are well made enough, they seem to sit awkwardly on me, and trouble me as much as the shirt of Nessus did Hercules of old. For the nonce, I am Sir Richard HOGHTON's retainer. I must own I was angry with myself when I saw Sir Ralph HOGHTON with his long train of gentlemen, all in murrey-coloured cloaks and doublets, at Mears Court Lodge, while I, his cousin, was habited like one of another house. And when I would have excused my apparent affection to Sir Ralph, he answered coldly, it was better as it was, for he could scarcely have found room for me among his friends. Do not fret yourself, Nicholas, rejoined Sherborne. Sir Ralph cannot reasonably take offence at a mere piece of good nature on your part, but this does not explain why Richard affects a colour so sombre. I am the retainer of one whose livery is sombre, replied the young man with a ghastly smile. But enough of this, he added, endeavouring to assume a livelier air. I suppose you are on your way to HOGHTON Tower. I thought to reach Preston before you were up, but I might have recollected you are no lie abed, Nicholas, not even after hard drinking overnight, as witness your feats at Warley. To be frank with you, I fear being led into light excesses, and so preferred passing the night at a quiet little inn at Walton-le-Dale, to coming on to you at the castle at Preston, which I know would be full of roisterers. Full it was, even to overflowing, replied the squire, but you should have come, Dick, for by my troth we had a right merry night of it. Stephen Hamerton of Hellyfield Heel, with his wife and her sister, sweet Mistress Doll Lister, supped with us, and we had music, dancing and singing, and abundance of good cheer. Now, Dick, Doll Lister is a delightful lass, and if you can only get Alison out of your head, would be just a wife for you. She sings like an angel, has the most captivating sigh and die-away manner, and the prettiest rounded figure ever body's kept in. Were I in your place, I should know where to choose, but you will see her at HOGHTON today, for she has to be at a banquet and a masquerade. Your description does not tempt me, said Richard. I have no taste for sigh and die-away damsels. Dorothy Lister, however, is accounted fair enough, but were she as fascinating as Venus herself in my present mood, I should not regard her. I, faith, lad, I pity you if such be the case, shrugging his shoulders, more in contempt than in compassion. Waste not your sympathy upon me, replied Richard. But tell me, how went the show at Preston yesterday? Excellently well, and much to his majesty's satisfaction, replied the squire. Proud Preston was never so proud before, and never with such good reason, for if the people be poor, according to the proverb, they take good care to hide their poverty. Bombards were fired from the bridge, and the church bells rang loud enough to crack the steeple and bring it down about the ears of the deafened liegers. The houses were hung with carpets and arras, the streets strewn ankle-deep with sand and sawdust. The cross in the marketplace was decked with garlands of flowers like a maypole, and the conduit near it ran wine. At noon there was more firing, and amidst flourishes of trumpets, rolling of drums, squeaking of fifes, and prodigious shouting, bonny King Jamie came to the cross, where a speech was made him by Master Barreras, the recorder, after which the corporation presented his majesty with a huge silver ball in token of their love and loyalty. The king seemed highly pleased with it, and observed to the Duke of Buckingham allowed him to be heard by the bystanders, who reported his speech to me. Heavens, saint, it's a broad bigger scene, and might serve for a christening cup if we had need of season a vessel, which heaven be praised. We had nay after this there was a grand banquet in the town hall, and when the heat of the day was over, the king left with his train for HOGHTON Tower, visiting the alum mines on the way thither. We are bidden to breakfast by Sir Richard, so we must push on. Dick, for his majesty, is an early riser like myself. We are to have rare sport today, hunting in the morning, banquet, and as I have already intimated, a masquerade at night, in which Sir George Goring and Sir John Binnet will play, and in which I have been solicited to take the ruling part of Jem Tosspot. Nay, laugh not, Dick Sherborne says, I shall play it to the life, as well as to find some mirthful dame to enact the companion part of Dol Wango. I have spoken with 2 or 3 on the subject, and fancy one of them will oblige me. There is another matter in which I am engaged. I am to present a petition to His Majesty from a great number of the lower orders in this country, praying they may be allowed to make their diversions as of old custom after divine service on Sundays. And though I am the last man to desire any violation of the Sabbath, being somewhat puritanically inclined, as they now phrase it, yet I cannot think any harm can ensure from lawful recreation and honest exercise. Still, I would anyone were chosen to present the petition rather than myself. Have no misgivings on the subject, said Richard, but urge the matter strongly, and if you need support, I will give you all I can. For I feel we are best observing the divine mandate by making the Sabbath a day of rest and observing it cheerfully, and this, I apprehend, is the substance of your petition. The whole sum and substance, replied Nicholas, and I have reason to believe His Majesty's wishes are in accordance with it. They are known to be so, said Sherborne. I am glad to hear it, cried Richard. Heaven save King James, the friend of the people. Aye, heaven save King James, echoed Nicholas, and if he grant this petition, he will prove himself their friend, and he will have all the clergy against him, and will be preached against from half the pulpits in the kingdom. Little harm will ensure if it should be so, replied Richard, for he will be cheered and protected by prayers of a grateful and happy people. They then rode on for a few minutes in silence, after which Richard inquired, You had brave doings at Myers Court Lodge, I suppose, Nicholas? Aye, marry, had we, answered the squire, and the feasting must have cost Ned Tylesele a pretty penny. Besides the king and his own particular attendants, there were some dozen noblemen and their followers, including the Duke of Buckingham, who moves about like a king himself, and I know not how many knights and gentlemen. Sherborne and I rode over from Dunor and reached the forest immediately after the king had entered it in his coach, so we took a short cut through the woods and came up just in time to join Sir Richard HOGHTON's train as he was riding up to His Majesty. Fancy a wide glade down which a great gilded coach is slowly moving, drawn by 8 horses, and followed by a host of noblemen and gentlemen in splendid apparel, their esquires and pages equally richly arrayed and equally well mounted, and after these numerous falconers, huntsmen, prickers, foresters, and yeomen with staghound in leash and horse on fist, all ready for the sport. Fancy all this if you can, Dick, and then conceive what a brave sight it must have been. Well, as I said, we came up in the very nick of time, for presently the royal coach stopped, and Sir Richard HOGHTON, calling all his gentlemen around him and bidding us dismount, we followed him and drew up bareheaded before the king, while Sir Richard pointed out to His Majesty the boundaries of the royal forest, and told him he would find it as well stocked with deer as any in his kingdom. Before putting an end to the conference, the king complimented the worthy knight on the gallant adherence of his train, and on learning we were all gentlemen, graciously signified his pleasure that some of us should be presented to him. Amongst others, I was brought forward by Sir Richard, and liking my looks, I suppose, the king was condescending enough to enter into conversation with me, and as his discourse chiefly turned on sporting matters, I was at home with him at once, and he presently grew so familiar with me that I almost forgot presence in which I stood. However, His Majesty seemed in no way offended by my freedom, but on the contrary, clapped me on the shoulder and said, Maister Assheton, for a country gentleman, you're well mannered and well informed, and I shall be glad to see more of you while I stay in these parts. After this, the good-natured monarch mounted his horse, and the hunting began, and a famous day's work we made of it, His Majesty killing no fewer than 5 fine bulls with his own hand. You were clearly on the road to preferment, Nicholas, observed Richard with a smile. You will outstrip Buckingham himself if you go on in this way. So I tell him, observed Sherborne, laughing, and by my faith, young Sir Gilbert HOGHTON, who, owing to his connection by marriage with Buckingham, is a greater man than his father, Sir Richard, looked quite jealous for the king more than once called out to Nicholas in the chase, and took the wood knife from him when he brought up the last year, which is accounted a mark of especial favour. Well, gentlemen, said the squire, I shall not stand in my own light, depend upon it, and if I should bask in court sunshine, you shall partake of the rays. If I do become master of the household in lie of the Duke of Richmond, or Master of the Horse and Cupbearer to His Majesty in place of His Grace of Buckingham, I will not forget you. We are greatly indebted to you, my Lord Marquess of Downham and Duke of Pendle Hill. That is to be rejoined Sherborne, taking off his cap with mock reverence. And perhaps for the sake of your sweet sister and my spouse Dorothy, you will make interest to have me appointed gentleman of bedchamber. Doubt it not, replied Nicholas in a patronising tone. My ambition soars higher than yours, Sherborne, said Richard. I must be Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal or nothing. Or what you will, gentlemen, what you will, cried Nicholas. You can ask me nothing I will not grant, always provided I have the means. A turn in the road now showed them HOGHTON Tower, crowning the summit of an isolated and conical hill about 2 miles off, rising proudly in the midst of air and fertile plain, watered by the Ribble and the Darwen. The stately edifice seemed to command the whole country, and so King James thought, as from the window of his chamber he looked down upon the magnificent prospect around him, comprehending on the one hand the vast forest of Myerscough and Bowland, stretching as far as the fells near Lancaster, and on the other an open but still undulating country, beautifully diversified with wood and water, well peopled and well cultivated, green with luxuriant pastures, yellow with golden grain, or embowered with orchards, boasting many villages and small towns, as well as 2 lovely rivers, which combining their currents at Waltonley Dale, gradually expanded till they neared the sea, which could be seen gleaming through openings in the distant hills, as the king surveyed this fair scene, and thought how strong was the position of the mansion situated, as it was upon high cliffs springing abruptly from the Darwen, and how favourably circumstanced with its forests and park for the enjoyment of the chase, which he was passionately fond, how capable of defence, and how well adapted for a hunting seat. He sighed, think it did not belong to the crown, nor was he wrong in his estimate of its strength, but in after years during the civil wars it held out stoutly against the parliamentary forces, and was only reduced at last by treachery, when part of its gate tower was blown up, destroying an officer and 200 men in that blast most woefully. Though the hour was so early, the road was already thronged, not only with horsemen and pedestrians of every degree from Preston, but with rude lumbering vehicles from the neighbouring villages of Pleasington, Brockhall and Curden, driven by farmers who with their buxom dames and cherry-cheeked daughters, decked out in holiday finery, all to gain admittance to HOGHTON Tower, or at all events to obtain a peep of the king as he rode to the hut. Most of these were saluted by Nicholas, who scrupled not to promise them admission to the outer court of the tower, and even went so far as to offer some of the comelier damsels presentation to the king. Occasionally the road was enlivened by strains of music from a band of minstrels, by a song or a chorus from others, or by the gamesome tricks of a party of mummers. At one place a couple of tumblers and a clown were performing their feats on a cloth stretched on the grass beneath a tree. Here the crowd collected for a few minutes, but presently gave way to loud shouts attended by the cracking of whips, proceeding from 2 grooms in the yellow and white livery of Sir Richard HOGHTON, who headed some half-dozen carts filled with provisions, carcasses of sheep and oxen, turkeys and geese, pullets and capons, fish, bread and vegetable, all bent for HOGHTON Tower. For though Sir Richard had made vast preparations for his guests, he found his supplies, great as they were, wholly inadequate to their wants. Cracking their whips in answer to the shouts with which they were greeted, the purveyors galloped on, many a hungry wight looking wistfully after them. Nicholas and his companions were now at the entrance of HOGHTON Park, through which the Darwen coursed. After washing the base of the rocky heights on which the mansion was situated, here 4 yeomen of the guard armed with halberds and an officer was stationed, and no one was admitted without an order from Sir Richard HOGHTON. Possessing a pass, the squire and his companions with their attendants were of course allowed to enter, but the throng accompanying them was sent over the bridge and along a devious road skirting the park, which through it went more than a mile round, eventually brought them to their destination. HOGHTON Park, though not very extensive, boasted a great deal of magnificent timber, and in some places was so thickly wooded that according to Dr. Curden, a man passing through it could scarcely have seen the sunshine at middle day. Into one of these tenebrous groves the horsemen now plunged, and for some moments were buried in the gloom produced by matted and overhanging boughs. Issuing once more into the warm sunshine, they traversed a long and beautiful sylvan glade, skirted by ancient oaks with mighty arms and gnarled limbs, and patriots of forests. In the open ground on the left were scattered a few ash trees, and beneath them browsed a herd of fallow deer, while crossing the lower end of the glade was a large herd of red deer, for which the park was famous, the hinds tripling nimbly and timidly away, but the lordly sides with their branching antlers standing for a moment at gaze, and disdainfully guarding the intruders on their domain. Little did they think how soon and severely their courage would be tried, or how soon the moat would be sound for their rise by the hundred. But if happily for themselves, for 11 quarter fools could not see their doom, it was not equally hidden from Nicholas, who predicted what would ensue, and pointed out one noble heart which he thought worthy to die by the king's own hand. As if he understood him, the stately beast tossed his antlers head along and plunged into the adjoining thicket. The squire noticed the spot where he had disappeared. The glade led them into the chase, a glorious hunting ground of about 2 miles in circumference, surrounded by an amphitheatre of wood and stood by noble forest trees. Variety and beauty were lent to it by an occasional knoll crowned with timber, or by numerous ferny dells and dingles. As the horsemen entered upon the chase, they observed at a short distance from them a herd of beautiful but fierce wild cattle, originally from moorland forest and still preserved in the park, white and spangled in colour, with short, sharp horns, fine eyes, and small, shapely limbs. These animals were of untamable fierceness, possessed of great cunning, and ever ready to assault anyone who approached them. They would often attack a solitary individual, gore him, and trample him to death. Consequently, they were far more dreaded than the wild boars, with which, as with every other sort of game, the neighbouring woods were plentifully stocked. Well aware of the danger they ran, the party watched the herd narrowly and distrustfully, and would have galloped on, but this would only have provoked pursuit, and the wild cattle were swifter than any horses. Suddenly, a milk-white bull trotted out from the rest of the herd, bellowing fiercely, lashing his sides with his tail, and lowering his head to the ground, as if meditating an attack. His example was speedily followed by the others, and the whole herd began to beat the ground and roll loudly. Much alarmed by these hostile manifestations, the party were debating whether to stand the onset or trust to the fleetness of their steeds to save them, when just as the whole herd, with tails erect and dilated nostrils, were galloping towards them, assistants appeared in persons of some 10 or a dozen mounted guards, armed with long poles pointed with iron, issued with loud shouts from an avenue opening upon the chase. At sight of them, the whole herd wheeled round and fled, but were pursued by the prickers till they were driven into the depths of Arthur's thicket. 6 of the prickers remained watching over them during the day, in order that the royal hunting party might not be disturbed, and the woods echoed the bellowing of the angry bulls. While this was going forward, the squire and his companions, congratulating themselves on their narrow escape, galloped off and entered the long avenue of sycamores from which the prickers had emerged at the head of the steep ascent, partly hewn out of the rock, partly skirted by venerable and majestic trees, forming a continuation of the avenue was the embattled gate tower of proud edifice they were approaching, and which now held the monarch of the land and the highest and noblest of his court. As guests within its walls, from the top of the central tower of the gateway floated a royal banner, while at the very moment the party reached up to them, they were saluted by a loud peal of ordnance discharged from the side towers, proclaiming that the king had arisen, and as the smoke from the culverins wreathed round the standard, a flourish of trumpets was blown from the walls, and martial music sounded from the court. Used by these stirring sounds, Nicholas spurred his horse up the rocky ascent, and followed closely by his companions, who were both nearly as much excited as himself, speedily gained the great gateway, a massive and majestic structure occupying the centre of the western front of the mansion, and consisting of 3 towers of great strength and beauty, the mid-tower far overtopping the other 2, as in the arms of old Castile, and sustaining, as was its right, the royal standard. On the platform stood the trumpeters with their silk-ringed clarions, and the iron mouse of the culverins, which had been recently discharged, protruded through the battlements. The arms and motto of the HOGHTON, carved in stone, placed on the gateway with the letters T.H., the initials of the founder of the tower. Immediately above the arched entrance was a sculptured figure of a knight slaying a dragon. In the front of the gateway, a large crowd of persons were assembled, consisting of the inferior gentry of the neighbourhood, with their wives, daughters, and servants, clergymen, attorneys, chirurgeons, farmers, and tradesmen of all kinds from the adjoining towns of Blackburn, Preston, Chorley, Haslingden, Garsand, and even Lancaster. Representatives in some sort or other of almost every town and village in the county might be found amongst the motley assemblage, which early as it was numbered several hundred, many of those from the more distant places having quitted their homes soon after midnight. Admittance was naturally so violent, but here the same rule was observed as at the park gate. No one was allowed to enter, even base court, without authority from the lord of mansion. The great gates were closed. 2 files of halberdiers were drawn up under the deep archway to keep the passage clear and quell disturbance in case any should occur, while a gigantic porter stationed in front of the wicket rigorously scrutinised the passers. These precautions naturally produced delay, and though many of the better part of the crowd were entitled to admission, him. It was not without much pushing and squeezing and considerable detriment to their gay apparel that they were unable to effect their object. The comfort of those outside the walls had not, however, been altogether neglected by Sir Richard HOGHTON, for sheds were reared under the trees where stout March beer, together with cheese and bread, or autumn cakes and butter, were freely distributed to all applicants, so that if some were disappointed, few were discontented, especially when told that the gates would be thrown open at noon, when during the time the king and the nobles feasted in the great banquet hall, they might partake of a wild bull from the park, slaughtered expressly for the occasion, which was now being roasted whole within the base court. That the latter was no idle promise, they had the assurance of its smoke rising above the wall, laden with the scent of roast meat, and moreover they could see through the wicket a great fire blazing and crackling on the green, with a huge carcass on an immense spit before it, and a couple of turned broaches basting it. As Nicholas and his companion forced their way through this crowd, which was momentarily receiving additions as fresh arrivals took place, the squire recognised many old acquaintances, and was nodding familiarly right and left, when he encountered a woman's eye fixed keenly upon him, and to his surprise beheld Nance Redfern. Nance, who had lost none of her good luck, was very gaily attired, with a fine chestnut hair knotted with ribbons, her stomacher similarly adorned, and her red petticoat looped up so as to display an exceedingly trim ankle and small foot. And under other circumstances Nicholas might not have minded staying to chat with her, but just now it was out of the question, and he hastily turned his head another way. As ill luck, however, would have it, a stoppage occurred at the moment, during which Nance forced her way up to him, and taking hold of his arm, said in a low tone, "You mun take me in with ye, squire." "Take you in with me? Impossible," cried Nicholas. "Nah, it's not impossible," rejoined Nance pertinaculously. "You can do it and you shan't. You owe me a good turn and mun repay it now." "But why the devil do you want to go in?" cried Nicholas impatiently. "You know the king is the sworn enemy of all witches, and amongst this concourse someone is sure to recognise you and betray you. I cannot answer for your safety. I do take you in. In my opinion you were extremely unwise to venture here at all. Never heed my wisdom or my folly, or do as I bid you or you'll repent it," said Nance. "Why, you can get in without my aid," observed the squire, trying to laugh it off. "You can easily fly over the walls." "I left my broomstick at home," replied Nance, "but no more jesting when you do it." Well, I suppose I must," replied Nicholas, "but I wash my hands of the consequences. If ill comes of it, I am not to blame. You must go in as Doll Wango, that is, as the character in the masquerade to be enacted tonight." The remark Nance signified that she perfectly understood him. The whole of this hurried discourse, conducted in an undertone, passed unheard and unnoticed by the bystanders. Just then an opening took place amid the crowd, and the squire pushed through it, hoping to get rid of his companion, but he fought in vain, for clinging to his saddle she went along with him. They were soon under the deep groined and ribbed arch of the gate, and Nance would have been here turned back by the foremost halberdier if Nicholas had not signified somewhat hastily that she belonged to his party. The man smiled and offered no further opposition, and the gigantic porter next advancing, Nicholas exhibited his pass to him, which appearing sufficiently comprehensive to procure admission for Richard and Sherborne, they instantly availed themselves of the licence, while the squire fumbled in his doublet for a further order for Nance. At last he produced it, and after reading it, the gigantic warder exclaimed, with a smile illumining his broad features, "Ha, I see, this is an order from his worship Sir Richard to admit a certain woman who is to enact Doll Wango at the masquerade. This is she, I suppose," he added, looking at Nance. Aye, replied the squire. "Aye, comely wench by the mass," exclaimed the porter. "Open the gate." "No, not yet, reporter, till my claim be adjusted," cried another woman, pushing forward, quite as young and comely as Nance, and gaily dressed. "I am the real Doll Wango, though I be generally known as Dame Tetlow. The squire engaged me to play the part before the king, and now this saucy pussy has taken my place. But I'll have my rights, that I will. Odds heart to Doll Wangos," exclaimed the porter, opening his eyes. "To nay believe there, but there be three," exclaimed an immensely tall, stoutly proportioned woman, stepping up to the increased confusion of the squire and the infinite merriment of the bystanders, whose laughter had been already excited by the previous part of the scene. "Didn't you tell me at Myers Court to come here, squire, and I, Bess Baldwin, would play Doll Wango to your gem tosspot?" "Play the devil, but that's what you all seem bent upon doing," exclaimed the squire impatiently. "Away with you, I can have nothing to say to you. You gave me the same promise at the castle at Preston last night," said Dame Tetlow. "I had been drinking and knew not what I said, rejoined Nicholas angrily. But you promised me a few minutes ago, and you're sober enough now, cried Nance. I don't know that, rejoined Dame Baldwin, looking reproachfully at him. But what I don't know is that another of these swimmers queens shan't go in before me, and she looked menacingly at them, as if determined to oppose their ingress, much to the alarm of the timorous Dame Tetlow, though Nance returned her anger glances unmoved. For heaven's sake, my fellow, let them all three in, said Nicholas in a low tone to Porter, at the same time slipping a gold piece into his hand, for there's no saying what may be the consequence for their three infernal viragos. I'll take the responsibility of their admittance upon myself, Sir Richard. Well, as your worship says, I don't like to see quarrelling amongst women, returned the Porter in a bland tone, so all three shall go in, and as to who is to play Dol Wango, the master of the ceremonies will settle that, so you need to give yourself no more concern about it. But if I were called on to decide, he added with an amorous leer at Dame Baldwin, whose portion so well matched his own, I know where my choice would lie. There now, he shouted, open wide the gate for Squire Nicholas Ashton of Downham and the three Dol Wangos. And all obstacles being thus removed, Nicholas passed on with the three females amidst the renewed laughter of the bystanders, but he got rid of his place as soon as he could, for dismounting and rowing his bridle to an attendant, he vouchsafed not a word to any of them, set quickly after Richard and Sherborne, who had already reached the great fire with the bull roasting before it. Appropriated chiefly to stables and other offices, the base court of HOGHTON Tower consisted of buildings of various dates, and greatly part belonged to Elizabeth's time, though some might be assigned to an earlier period, while many alterations and additions had been recently made in anticipation of the king's visit. Dating back as far as Henry II, the family had originally fixed their residence at Utterhill on the banks of the Darwen, but in process of time, swayed by prouder notions, they mounted the craggy heights above and built a tower upon their crest. It is melancholy to think that so glorious a pile, teeming with so many historical recollections and so magnificently situated, should be abandoned and so to go to decay, the family having many years ago quitted it for Walton Hall near Walton le Dale and consigned it to the occupation of a few gamekeepers. Bereft of its vulnerable timber, its horse grass grown, its fine oak staircase rotting and dilapidated, its domestic chapel neglected, its marble chamber broken and ruinous, its wainscotings and ceilings cracked and mouldering, its paintings mildewed and half effaced, HOGHTON Tower presents only the wreck of its former grandeur. Desolate indeed are its halls, and their glory forever departed. However, this history has to do with it in the season of its greatest splendour, when it glistened with silks and velvets, and resounded with loud laughter and blithe music, when stately nobles and lovely dames were seen in the gallery, and a royal banquet was served in the great hall, when its countless chambers were filled to overflowing, and its passages echoed with hasty feet, when the base court was full of huntsmen and falconers, and enlivened by the neighing of steeds and the baying of hounds, when there was daily hunting in the park, and nightly dancing and diversions in the hall. It is with HOGHTON Tower at this season that the present tale has to do, and not with it as it is now, silent, solitary, squalid, saddening, but still whispering of the glories of the past, still telling of the kingly pageant that once graced it. The base court was divided from the court of lodging by the great hall and domestic chapel. A narrow vaulted passage on either side led to the upper quadrangle, the facade of which was magnificent and far superior in uniformity of design and style to the rest of the structure, the irregularity of which however was not unpleasing. The whole frontage of the upper court was richly moulded and filleted with ranges of mullion and transom windows, capitals and carved parapets crowned with stone balls. Marble pillars in the Italian style had been recently placed near the porch, with two rows of pilasters above them supporting a heavy marble cornice on which rested a carved escutcheon of the family. A flight of stone steps led up to the porch, and within was a wide oak staircase, so gentle of ascent that a man on horseback could easily mount it, a feat often practiced in the later days by one of the descendants of the house. In this part of the mansion all the principal apartments were situated, and here James was lodged. Here also was the green room, so called from its hangings, which he used for private conferences, and which was hung round with portraits of his unfortunate mother Mary, Queen of Scots, of her implacable enemy Queen Elizabeth, of his consort Anne of Bohemia, and Sir Thomas HOGHTON, the founder of the tower. Adjoining it was the Star Chamber occupied by the Duke of Buckingham, with its napkin panelling and ceiling fretted with golden wires, and in the same angle were rooms occupied by the Duke of Richmond, the Earls of Pembroke and Nottingham, and Lord Howard of Effingham. Below was the library, with Dr. Thomas Morton, Bishop of Chester, and His Majesty's chaplain, with three Pusine judges of the King's Bench, Sir John Doddridge, Sir John Crook, and Sir Robert HOGHTON, all of whom were guests of Sir Richard, resorted, and in the adjoining wing was the great gallery, where the whole of the nobles and courtiers passed such of their time, and that was not much as was not occupied in feasting or outdoors amusements. Long corridors ran round the upper stories in this part of the mansion, and communicated with an endless series of rooms, which, numerous as they were all occupied, and accommodation being found impossible for the whole of guests. Many were sent to the new erections in the base court, which had been planned to meet the emergency by the magnificent and provident horse. The nobles and gentlemen were, however, far outnumbered by their servants, and the confusion occasioned by the running to and fro of the various rooms of the chambers was indescribable. Doublets had to be brushed, ruffs plaited, hair curled, beards trimmed, and all with the greatest possible expedition, so that as soon as they dawned upon Houghton Tower, there was a prodigious racket from one end of it to the other. Many favoured servants slept in truckle beds in their master's rooms, but others, not so fortunate and unable to find accommodation even in the garrets for the smallest rooms, and those nearest a room put in requisition, slept upon the benches in the hall, while several sat up all night carousing in the great kitchen, keeping company with cooks and their assistants, who were busied all the time in preparations for the feasting of the morrow. Such was the state of things inside Houghton Tower early on the eventful morning in question, and out of doors, especially in the base court which Nicholas was traversing, the noise, bustle, and confusion were equally great. Wide as was the area, it was filled with various personages, some newly arrived and seeking information as to their quarters, not very easily obtained, for it seemed everybody's business to ask questions, nor one to answer them. Some gathered in groups round the falconers and huntsmen, who had suddenly risen into great importance. Others, and these were for the most part smart young pages in brilliant liveries, chattering and making love to every pretty damsel they encountered, putting them out of countenance by their licence and strange oaths, and rousing the anger of their parents and the jealousy of their rustic admirers. Others of a graver sort, with dress of formal cut and puritanical expression of countenance, shrugging their shoulders and looking sourly on the whole proceedings. Luckily they were in the minority, for the generality of the groups were composed of lively and light-hearted people, bent apparently upon amusement, and tolerably certain of finding it. Though these various groups, numerous lackeys were passing swiftly and continuously to and fro, bearing a cap, a mantle, or a sword, and pushing aside all who interfered with their progress, with a "By your leave, my masters, your pardon, fair mistress," or "Out of my way, knave." And as the stable occupied one entire angle of the court, they were grooms without end, dressing the horses at the doors, watering them at the truss, or leading them about amid the admiring or criticising bystanders. The king's horses were, of course, objects of special attraction, and such as could obtain a glimpse of them and of the royal coach thought themselves especially favoured. Besides what was going forward below, the windows looking into the court were all full of curious observers, and much loud conversation took place between those placed at them and their friends underneath. From all this some idea will be formed of the tremendous din that prevailed, but though with much confusion, there was no positive disorder, still less brawling, for yeomen of the guard being stationed at various points, perfect order was maintained. Several minstrels, mummers, and merrymakers in various fantastic habits swelled the throng, enlivening it with their strains or feats, and amongst other privileged characters admitted was a Tom of Bedlam, a half-crazed licensed beggar in a singular and picturesque garb, with a plate of tin engraved with his name attached to his left arm, and a great ox's horn which he was continually blowing, suspended by a leathern baldric from his neck. Scarcely had Nicholas joined his companions than word was given that the king was about to attend morning prayers in the domestic chapel. Upon this, an immediate rush was made in that direction by the crowd, but the greater part were kept back by the guard, who crossed their halberts to prevent their ingress, and a few only were allowed to enter the antechamber leading to the chapel, amongst whom were the squire and his companions. Here they were detained within it till service was over, and as prayers were read by the Bishop of Chester and the whole court was present, this was a great disappointment to them. At the end of half an hour, two very courtly personages came forth, each bearing a white wand, and announcing that the king was coming forth. An assemblage immediately divided into two lines to allow a passage for the monarch. Nicholas Assheton informed Richard in a whisper that the foremost and stateliest of the two gentlemen was Lord Stanhope of Harrington, the vice-chamberlain, and the other, handsome young man of slight figure and somewhat libertine expression of countenance, was the renowned Sir John Vinnet, master of the ceremonies. Notwithstanding the licentiousness, however, which was vice of the age and the stain of the court, Sir John was a man of wit and address, and perfectly conversant with the duties of his office, of which he has left satisfactory evidence in an amusing tractate, Vinete Philoxenis, some little time elapsed before the king made his appearance, during which the curiosity of such as had not seen him, as was the case with Richard, was greatly excited. The young man wondered whether the pedantic monarch, whose character perplexed the shrewdest, would answer his preconceived notions, and whether it would turn out that his portraits were like him. While these thoughts were passing through his mind, a shuffling noise was heard without, and King James appeared at the doorway. He paused there for a moment, to place his plumed and jewelled cap on his head, and to speak a word with Sir John Vinnet, and during this Richard had an opportunity of observing him. The portraits were like, but the artist had flattered him, though not much. There was great shrewdness of look. There was also a vacant expression which seemed to contradict the idea of profound wisdom generally ascribed to him. When in perfect repose, which they were not for more than a minute, the features were thoughtful, benevolent, and pleasing, and Richard began to think him quite handsome, when another change was wrought by some remark of Sir John Vinnet. As the master of the ceremonies told his tale, the king's fine dark eyes blazed with an unpleasant light, and he laughed so loudly and indecorously at the close of the narrative, with his great tongue hanging out of his mouth and tears running down his cheeks, that the young man was quite sickened. The king's face was thin and long, the cheeks shaven, but the lips clothed with moustaches, and a scanty beard covered his chin. The hair was brushed away from the face, and the cap placed at the back of the head, so as to exhibit a high, bold forehead, of which he was prodigiously vain. James was fully equipped for the chase, and wore a green silk doublet quilted as all his garments were, so as to be dagger-proof. Enormous trunk hose, likewise thickly stuck, and both boots fitting closely to the leg, and turned slightly over at the knee, with the edges fringed with gold. This was almost the only appearance of finery about the dress, except a row of gold buttons down the jerkin. Attached to his girdle, he wore a large pouch with a mouth drawn together by silken cords, and a small silver bugle was suspended from his neck by a baldric of green silk, stiffly starched bands edged with lace, and slightly turned down on either side of the face, completed his attire. There was nothing majestic, but the very reverse, in the king's deportment, and he seemed only kept right by the exceeding stiffness of his cumbersome clothes. With the appearance of being corpulent, he was not so in reality, and his weak legs and bent knees were scarcely able to support his frame. He always used a stick, and generally sought the additional aid of a favourite's arm. In this instance, the person selected was Sir Gilbert Houghton, the oldest son of Sir Richard, and subsequent owner of Houghton Tower, indebted for the high court favour he enjoyed partly to his graceful person and accomplishments, partly to his marriage. Having espoused the daughter of Sir John Ashton of Cranford, who, as sister of the Duchess of Buckingham and a descendant of the blood royal of the Stuarts, was a great help to his rapid rise, the handsome young knight was skilled in all manly exercises, and cited as a model of grace in the dance. Constant in attendance upon the court, he frequently took part in the masquerades formed before it. Like the king, he was fully equipped for hunting, but greater contrast could not have been found than between his tall fine form and the king's ungainly figure. Sir Gilbert had remained behind with the rest of the courtiers in the chapel, but calling him, James seized his arm and set forward at his unusual shambling pace as he went on, nodding his head in return to the profound salutations of the assemblage. His eye rolled round them until it alighted on Richard Ashton, and nudging Sir Gilbert, he asked, "What's that a bonny lad but awesomely pale?" Sir Gilbert, however, was unable to answer the inquiry, but Nicholas, who stood beside the young man, was determined not to lose the opportunity of introducing him, and accordingly moved a step forward and made a profound obeisance. "This youth, may please your majesty," he said, "is my cousin Richard Ashton, son and heir of Sir Richard Ashton of Middleton, one of your majesty's most loyal and devoted servants, and who I trust will have the honour of being presented to you in court today. Trust so to Master Nicholas Ashton, for that if we didn't forget is your own name, replied James, and if a sire resembles the son, well, is not always the case, as our buddy friend Sir Gilbert is evident, being as unlike his worthy father as a man well can be. If, as we say, Sir Richard resembles his talent, he must be a well-furred gentleman. But God santy lad, how come you in six-side and sombre habiliments, I in my clothes to put on to grace our company? Black is now the fashion at our court, as Sir Gilbert will tell you, and though a suit of sables may become you, it's no pleasing in our sight. Let us see you in gayer apparel at dinner." Richard, who was considerably embarrassed by the royal address, merely bowed, and Nicholas again took upon him himself to answer for him. Your Majesty will be pleased to pardon him, he said, but he is unaccustomed to court fashions, having passed all his time in a wild and uncivilized district where, except on rare and happy occasions like present, the refined races of life seldom reach us. Well, we wouldn't be hard upon him, said the king good-naturedly, and mayhap the family has sustained some recent loss, and he is in mourning. I cannot offer that excuse for him, sire, replied Nicholas, who began to flatter himself he was making considerable progress in the monarchs of races. It is simply an affair of the heart. Poor child, we pity him, cried the king, and say it is a hopeless suit, young sir, he added to Richard. Can we throw in a good word for ye? Do we ken the lassie, and is she to be here today? I am quite at a loss how to answer your Majesty's question, replied Richard, and my cousin Nicholas has very unfairly betrayed my secret. Toot now, lad, exclaimed James. It was not he what betrayed your secret, but our own discernment that revealed it to us. We kenned your ailment at a glance. Few things are hidden from the king's eye, and we tell ye more about yourself and the lassie you're dying for, if you care to speak it. But just now we have other fish to fry. We must aware and break our fast, of which if the truth man be spoken, we stand greatly in need. For creature from this man be I look to as well as spiritual ones, though the latter should be ever cared for first, as is our aim rule, and in so doing we offer an example to our subjects, which they will do well to follow. Later in the day we will talk further to you on the subject, but meanwhile give us the name of your lassie. Or spare me, your Majesty, cried Richard. Her name is Alison Nutter, interposed Nicholas. What, a daughter of Alice Nutter, roughly exclaimed James. The same, sire, replied Nicholas, much surprised at the extent of information manifested by the king. Why, soul or my body, man, she's a witch, a witch. Do you ken that? Cried the king with a look of adorance, a mischievous and malignant vermin with which this part of our realm is sage plagued, but which with heaven's help we will thoroughly extirpate. Say the lass is a daughter of Alice Nutter. That accounts for your gruesome looks, lad. Odds alive, I see it all now. I understand what is the matter with you. Look at him, Sir Gilbert, look at him, I say. Does nothing strike you as strange about him? Nothing more than that he is naturally embarrassed by your Majesty's mode of speech, replied the knight. You lack the penetration, the king, Sir Gilbert, cried James. I will tell you what ails him. He is bewitched or spoken. Exclamations were uttered by all bystanders, and every eye was fixed on Richard, who felt ready to sink to the ground. I affirm he is bewitched, continued the king, and what's so likely to do it as the glamouring hizzy that has ensnared him. She has ill blood in her veins, and can chant devil's cantrips as well as the Mive or any Carline of them. You are mistaken, sire, cried Richard earnestly. Alison will be here today with my father and sister, and if you deign to receive her, I am sure you will judge her differently. We shall append the point of receiving her, replied the king gravely, but we are rarely mistaken, young man. We seldom change our opinion except on guide ground, and those you arena likely to offer us. Belike ye had been lang ill, or no, your Majesty, I was suddenly seized about a month ago, replied Richard. Suddenly seized, exclaimed James, winking cunningly at those near him. And ye swore it, I were with the pain, I guessed it, and was Alison the while? At the time she was a guest at Middleton, replied Richard, but it is impossible my illness can in any way be attributed to her. I will answer with my life for her perfect innocence. You may have to answer with your life for your misplaced faith in her, said the king, but I tell you nothing wicked at all events is impossible to witches, and the Hale case, even by your own showing, is very suspicious. I have heard somewhat of the story of Alice Nutter, but not the Hale truth, but there are folk here what can enlighten us much fuller. Thus much I do ken, that she is a notorious witch and a fugitive from justice. Though Abelin's you, Master Nicholas Ashton, could give an inkling of her hiding place if you were so disposed. Nay, never look doited, man, he added laughing. I bring no charges against you. You arena on your trial no, but this is a serious matter, and mine be seriously considered before we dismiss it. You say Alison will be here today, so farewell. Can you contrive to produce a mother too, Master Nicholas? Sure, exclaimed Nicholas. Nay, then we man gang our ain way to war, continued James. We are told you have a petition to offer us, and our will and pleasure is that you present it or we go to the chase, and after we have partaken of our matutinal reflection, we will no longer delay. For sooth to say, we are well nigh famished. Look ye, sirs, neither of you is to quit HOGHTON Tower without our mission had and obtained. We do not place you under arrest, neither do we inhabit you from the chase or from any other source, but you are to remain here at our sovereign pleasure. Have we your word that you will not attempt to disobey the injunction? You have mine undoubtedly, sire, replied Richard. And mine too, added Nicholas, and I hope to justify myself before your majesty. We shall be well pleased to hear ye do it, man, rejoined the king, laughing and shuffling on. But we have our doubts, we have our doubts. His majesty talks of going to breakfast, and says he is famished, observed Nicholas to Sherborne as the king departed. But he has completely taken away my appetite. No wonder, replied the other.